Well, we've been learning how to be wise by looking at the advice that is given to us by Solomon in the book of Proverbs. The Bible says that Solomon was the wisest man who had ever lived up to his time, and it goes on to say that he would be the wisest man who would ever live. So if he really was the wisest man who ever lived, it goes to reason that the things he wrote would be things that we ought to pay attention to. Unfortunately, Solomon didn't completely practice what he preached. However, I think that what he teaches in Proverbs is more than just head knowledge. I think that these are the things that he had actually learned by trial and error. And because he did make some mistakes in his life, he was trying to keep his son from repeating those same mistakes. He says, listen to me, son, I know what I'm talking about. Not just because God gave me supernatural wisdom, but because I didn't always follow my own wisdom that I was given, and I made some mistakes. So please learn from my mistakes. How many parents have done that with your own kids? You've tried to tell them about the mistakes that you've made and shield them from making some of those same mistakes because you know the pain that comes from those things, but they don't listen. And just like our kids don't listen to us, unfortunately, most of us don't listen to the wisdom of Solomon either. We have to repeat the mistakes, and we have to go through a lot of the problems that he experienced because we refuse to listen to someone else. Although the nation of Israel was considered to be the strongest that it ever was during Solomon's reign, in fact, even going back historically, they say those were the finest years for Israel at that time. They had the most money, they had the most peace. It was a great time for Israel. But shortly after his death, things began to spiral downward very quickly. And that downward spiral was a direct result of decisions and choices that Solomon had made during his reign. The nation and his own children ended up following the example that he had set for many of his years, instead of following the advice that he gave them. Now, we're not sure exactly at what point in his life the book of Proverbs was written. We don't even know for sure that he actually wrote the book himself. Many Bible scholars believe that Proverbs is simply a compilation of wise sayings that he had made during his life that somebody had jotted down, and they put it into book form after his death. Well, I have my own theory about the book. I think that it was written by Solomon towards the end of his life, the same time he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. I believe he looked back at his life, realized that he had made mistakes, and said, I want to protect other people. I don't want them to make the bad decisions that I've made. So he wrote 2 books. He wrote the book of Proverbs for his son to say, son, you're soon going to be the king, and you can actually be a better king than I was if you listen to my wisdom and don't go out and have to try to figure things out on your own. Then at the same time, he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes to apologize to the nation of Israel and say, you know what? I hope you didn't learn from my example. I had good things to say, but I didn't practice what I preached. And let me tell you what I learned from the mistakes that I made. I believe they were both reflective as he looked back over his life and said, I made some mistakes. Many of the Proverbs refer to why a king should or should not do certain things. And the book of Ecclesiastes was just him explaining, I tried it all, and everything I tried was worthless. Solomon knew that the nation had been watching him. Many wanted to be like him. They said, if I could just be Solomon, because in the world's wisdom, Solomon was successful. And he says, you might think I was successful, but let me give you the backstory. Let me tell you what this really means. He wrote about everything that he had done, especially those things that the world would look at as successful, and said, no, that's not where it's really at. Throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, he says, I did this, I experienced this, I attained this. But after each of those things, he says, but it was a waste of time. Today, I want to give you a quick summary of the book of Ecclesiastes as we come to the end of our study on wisdom. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 to 2 says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. The whole world at that time was looking to Solomon for answers. We read in the Bible about how the kings and the queens and the rulers of other nations would come to him. They said, this man is successful. This man knows how to do it. We're going to come and get advice from him. He was the most successful person that had ever lived. He was the wisest person that had ever lived. He was the wealthiest person alive. He was the most famous man alive. He had everything according to the world standards. But as he's coming to the end of his life, he looks back. He looks at everything he has, everything he'd accomplished. He says, it has not brought me true happiness. It has not brought me true success. Maybe success in the world's way of looking at things, but it's not success. He wished he had spent more time and invested more energy into the one thing that he had neglected. So most of the book of Ecclesiastes talks about all of the things that he pursued and accomplished and finally realized were futile. The first thing he talks about in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 12 to 18 is wisdom. Now you will recall that at the beginning of Solomon's reign, that was the only goal that he had. God said, ask for anything, I'll give it to you. And Solomon said, I want wisdom. That was a noble thing to request. In fact, God was so pleased that he had asked for wisdom that God said, because you've asked for wisdom and you've asked for wisdom for the right reasons, not just so you can brag about how smart you are, but you've asked for wisdom to be a righteous ruler. You've asked for wisdom to know how to do things my way. Because you've asked for that type of wisdom, I will give you everything else. But Solomon got so eager for wisdom that he started going beyond the wisdom that God gave him, and he started pursuing wisdom from other things. He started asking other people for wisdom too, and he didn't rely strictly on God's wisdom. The more Solomon learned, the more he wanted to learn. Eventually, he began to seek wisdom just for the sake of wisdom, and he began to seek wisdom not simply from God, but from books and from other people. He started listening to philosophers of the day and those kinds of things. He simply wanted wisdom. So he comes to the end of his life and he says, you know what, I learned a lot of things, but a lot of the things I learned really don't matter. In fact, some of the things I've learned led me down the wrong path because they weren't godly wisdom. They were man's wisdom. So he says, knowledge, wisdom is meaningless. It's not meaningless if it's the right type of wisdom, if it's God's wisdom, if it propels us to do things God's way. But he said, the way I pursued wisdom, all of it wasn't godly wisdom. And the pursuit of knowledge, if it's not for the right reasons, is worthless. It's meaningless. He then talks about pleasures. Because of his wealth and position, he was able to do anything that he desired to do. And he goes as far as to say this in Ecclesiastes 2:10. He says, I denied myself nothing that my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. If he wanted to do something, he did it. And he came to the point in his life where he was seeking pleasure so much that he said, I want this, I want this, I want this. And he just did it. He had the money. He had the fame. I mean, nobody's going to tell him what to do. He could do whatever he wanted. He denied himself nothing. Unfortunately, some of those things were not godly in nature, and they led him down the wrong path. But then he adds in verse 11, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. He talks about working hard and accomplishing things. Once again, he says everything he put his hand to was successful, but at the end of his life, when he looked back, all those things, because some of them were done without God, meant absolutely nothing. Although he was admired by the world for his successes, he said, I'm disgusted, I'm disappointed in all the time I wasted in doing things that weren't for God. He talks about advancement. Many people think that if they could just get to the top of their business or be the best at their game, they'd be happy. Solomon had risen to the top of everything, He was the richest, the wisest, the most famous, the most successful. But yet he was still miserable. And again, he says, advancement is meaningless. He talks about his wealth. He says riches are meaningless. To the world, he was successful. But he says, nothing I have done or achieved really matters. Why? Because he realizes that he'd done a lot of it without God. Solomon talks about relationships of all kinds. He had friends, he had servants, he had employees, he had admirers, and he had lovers. In fact, Solomon had 1,000 wives. Well, actually, it was 700 wives and 300 concubines. But in most aspects, that means the same thing. A concubine in those days was still a legal wife. In fact, if you were to get rid of a concubine, you had to go through the same process. It was the same divorce process as for a wife. The only real difference was that a concubine had started out as a servant or a slave, and therefore they owned nothing, and they would inherit nothing from their husband on his death. A real wife, her children could inherit part of the estate. A concubine inherited nothing. Once the husband was gone, that marriage was null and void, and they had nothing coming to them. That's really the only difference. Because of his many wives, Solomon also had many children. And if we read the scriptures, it says that blessed is the man whose quiver is full of children. Well, if any man should be blessed, it should be Solomon. He had hundreds and hundreds of children. Probably thousands because of the number of wives that he had. If lots of friends, a large family, romance, or sex could buy happiness, Solomon should have been the happiest man alive. But he said all of these relationships mean nothing. Why? Because he was lacking in the one relationship that really mattered. None of our relationships will ever work unless we have the proper relationship with God first. Now, actually, as far as we know, nothing that Solomon did was illegal. None of it was even immoral based on the laws of the culture of that time. We look at the issue of having multiple wives through the culture and the laws that we have today, but Solomon wasn't breaking any rules. Most of the kings in those days had multiple wives. Even his father David had multiple wives. In fact, a king without multiple wives was almost unheard of. He was just doing what was expected, and it wasn't even forbidden by God's laws. That's how treaties were signed in those days. When you signed a peace treaty with a nation, you would give each other daughters to have as wives. Here, to fulfill this treaty and to maintain peace, you can have one of my daughters as your wife, because once it becomes the father-in-law, once you're my father-in-law, or once you're related to me, we're not going to fight each other. Most of Solomon's wives had been given to him by neighboring nations that wanted to be his allies. Even prominent men that weren't kings, though, had multiple wives. Some of the laws that God gave to Moses for the Israelites had to do with wives and concubines and how they're to be treated. So even concubines, God allowed those. God says, if you have a concubine, this is how you are to treat her. Essentially, in those days, as long as a man had enough money to support his wives and children and not have to rely on somebody else for their support, he could have as many wives and as many children as he wanted. But there was one stipulation that God had given, and this is the one thing that tripped Solomon up. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, God commanded the Israelites not to make treaties with other nations and not to intermarry with them. That's where Solomon messed up. He was following the customs of everyone else. This is how we make peace treaties. Well, in the first place, God said, don't make treaties with those nations around you. I want you to be different. But he was doing it the way everybody else did it. Why didn't God want them to make treaties or intermarry with other nations? It tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 4. It says, for they, the intermarriages, they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. God was primarily concerned with the children turning to follow other gods. God knew that the mothers would be the biggest influence on the children, at least during the formative years, and that if the mothers were worshiping idols, the children would adopt the religion of their mother. Normally, the father would stay true to the way he had been raised, but his children would grow up different because they had that outside influence. But the decision to marry a foreigner would have negative consequences for future generations. The Bible never forbids interracial marriage, but it does condemn interfaith marriage. Now, when I say faith, I'm not necessarily saying Pentecostal versus Baptist or something, although that can cause conflicts. If there's a major difference in theology, that itself can cause conflicts. But to intermarry with somebody who doesn't even share the same God that you have, or someone who doesn't believe in God when you do, that is really going to cause conflicts in the marriage. How are the kids going to be raised? Which church are they going to be part of? Which religion are they going to? Are they going to believe in God? Are they not going to believe in God? That causes problems. So God forbade that. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14 says, "Do not be yoked together with unbelievers." This scripture has been taken out of context down through the years, and a lot of people use this to say you can't marry someone of another race. The Bible never says that. Many prominent people in the Bible were married to people of other races. Even Moses had an Ethiopian wife. It says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness?" We see that principle played out over and over again in the Bible. Every time the Israelites ignored God's instructions and allowed their children to intermarry with the surrounding nations, it was only a short time before the Israelite nation as a whole was worshiping other gods. But in Solomon's case, it didn't even take a generation. Solomon himself adopted the gods of the foreign women that he had married. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 6, we read this. "King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, 'You must not intermarry with them.'" So he violated God's law right there. You shall not intermarry with those nations. But he took the wisdom of the world, not the wisdom of God. "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after other gods." That's what God said. Don't marry them, because this is what will happen. People always think, well, maybe for other people. I'm stronger than that. I'm going to be the influencer. I'm going to marry this person. I know they don't believe in God, but because they're married to me, I'm going to be able to win them over. Very seldom have I ever seen that work. It usually works the other way. God said, don't do it. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. Then this is where we read, he had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. Now, notice it says 700 wives of royal birth. 700 wives that had been given to him by the other nations. It's very possible, in fact, probable, that he also had other wives who were from the Israelite nation itself. The Bible only tells us how many he had from other nations. 700 wives of royal birth, 300 concubines, and his wives did exactly what God said they were going to do. His wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David, his father, had done. Now listen carefully now, because what we just read is very important. It was Solomon's wives that led him to worship other gods. But the root of the problem goes much deeper than that. In verse 4, we read that Solomon's heart was not fully devoted to God. And in verse 6, we read that Solomon did not father the Lord completely. Solomon's problem was that God wasn't enough for him. He started out on the right track. On the right track, his heart was in the right place. He wanted to be righteous. He wanted to follow God. But somehow he decided, okay, I've got God. But look at what they're doing. That looks interesting. That looks fun. Can't I have God and have that too? So he started making compromises in his own life. He wanted God. He wanted to please God. But he wanted other things as well. God had already given him everything that he could ever need. Not necessarily want, but need. God had already given him wisdom, wealth, position, all those things that God promised. I will give you these things because you asked for wisdom. But Solomon wanted more. He wanted some things that God couldn't give. Why doesn't God give us something? Because he knows it's not good for us. God will give us what's good. If God doesn't give it to us, we shouldn't pursue it because we will end up like Solomon. Instead of being happy with what God provided, Solomon took it upon himself to get what the world could provide as well. Solomon never completely turned his back on God. He still worshiped God, but he didn't worship God alone. Now we hear a lot about Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was a beautiful building that was built to replace the tabernacle that the Israelites had been using for hundreds of years. It started in the wilderness, and for the first so many generations after moving into the promised land, they still used that portable tabernacle. David came up with a design for the temple. Solomon actually built the temple, a beautiful place for God. Unfortunately, it wasn't the only temple that Solomon built. In 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 7 through 10, we read this. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burnt incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Now, maybe it wasn't complete temples, but he built shrines for these other gods. Probably started out to keep his wives happy. You know, Solomon had every right as king. I mean, he shouldn't have married them in the first place, but as king, he could have said, okay, you're my wife, but you will give up your false gods. You will give up your religion, and you will follow my God. He had the right to say that, but he didn't. He said, you go ahead and worship. In fact, I'll even make it easy for you to worship. Let me build a place for you to worship. And it wasn't long before Solomon was bowing down before their idol. Didn't completely give up his God, but he began to add to and adopt the customs of the nations around him, adopt the belief system of those wives that he never should have had in the first place. Solomon wanted all the wisdom of God, but he also wanted the wisdom of the world. Unfortunately, the wisdom of the world is usually the opposite of God's wisdom. You can't have it both ways. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 25, we read, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than any human strength." So if God's wisdom is better and God's strength is stronger, why do we even need those things? 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 19 says, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, He catches the wise in their craftiness." Fortunately, before his death, Solomon realized the error of his ways, and he repented. You know, there's debate on whether or not he died in his sin. I don't think so. I think Proverbs and Ecclesiastes were written when he came back to God and said, God, I've messed up. I want to get back to you. Unfortunately, his life was past by that point. He didn't have a whole lot of life left to live, and he did the best he could to correct the errors that he had made by writing these books. But he had wasted so many years. He's trying to spare the nation of Israel, his own children, and us the agony of having to learn things the hard way, like he did. So after explaining in Ecclesiastes that he had everything and did everything that can possibly be done, after experimenting with all of the options, he gives us the answer to life. He said, I've done it all, I've seen it all, I've said it all, I've experienced it all, but there's only one thing that really matters. Ecclesiastes 12:13. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. In his letter to the Ephesians, Paul writes this. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 to 17. Be careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. We make hundreds of choices each day. The choices we make determine our future, the future of our children, and even the future of our nation and our world. If we go through life just letting things happen, we're going to come to the end of our lives with regrets. We're going to look back at everything, and we're going to see how much time we wasted and how much energy we put into things that will disappear when we disappear. I know so many people that come to the end of their lives and they've looked back and they have regrets. Their energy, their money, it was all invested in things that don't have eternal value. And they say, if I had my life to live over again, I would do it differently. Unfortunately, we only have one life to live. We need to learn now, not then. We need to learn now what really matters. Paul says we need to be careful. We can't just leave life up to chance. We also can't look to the world to get instructions on how to live and for what's right and wrong. The world is clueless when it comes to life. They don't know how to live. They didn't create life. They're trying to figure it out. We need to listen to the creator of life. We need to follow His instructions. We all want the blessings of God. We love the verse that says, I have great plans for you. But we don't go on and read. We only get those great plans that God has if we follow the instructions that He gave. The blessed life comes from honoring God, from following His commands. We need to take our clues from God, not from the world. Instead of listening to what the world has to say, we need to figure out what the Lord's will is. Then we don't read that in magazines or books. We read that here in this book. We read that in times on our knees in prayer, seeking the Holy Spirit, saying, okay, God, I want you to talk to me directly. I've heard what everybody else has to say, but what's your answer? God will speak to us if we're listening, but too often we aren't even asking Him. We're asking everyone else. Some of us try to listen to God, but we have the same problem that Solomon had. We want to honor God, but we also want what the world has to offer. I want God, but I also want this. We want God, but we haven't come to the place where we realize God is all we need. All those other things look familiar. We think we need them. We don't. All we need is God. When it comes right down to it, it doesn't matter how successful the world thinks we are, or whether or not the world is happy with our choices. On Judgment Day, the only thing that will matter, the only things that will matter, are the things that we did for God and with God's help. There's a wise saying that says, keep the main thing the main thing. But I think the advice that Solomon would give, and he gives it just in different words, I think Solomon would say, keep the main thing the only thing. Those other things don't matter at all. Keep the main thing. Keep God as the only thing. Pursue God and God alone. Let God be the source of everything that you have. The only thing that really matters is to honor, to respect, to obey God, to keep His commandments, to do what He says in His Word.